Welcome folks to part 3 of my great guitar build of Scratch build. First of all, greetings go out to Jonne. Hi Jonne, schön, dass du wieder dabei bist. Freut mich wirklich sehr. Du darfst ja gerne mal in meine Werkstatt kommen. Now we go on. Episode 3 is dedicated once again to the body. You can see me drawing the outlines of the template onto the body, and then I went over to the bandsaw to cut the outlinings out. The blade that I'm using is actually a little bit too wide. It would be better to use a 6 or 8 millimeter wide curve cutting blade, but as you can see in my episodes before, it takes a lot of time to adjust a new bandsaw blade on my old bandsaw, so this blade was adjusted pretty good, so I leave it there and take my time using more cuts for the inner circles of the body. It really helps to cut off most of the material, so maybe 1 or 2 millimeters are left. That's so the router bit doesn't have to work that hard. So while building guitars, it is always a very important step to mark your center line. Here you can see me mark the center line on the body. And next step is to put double-sided gluing tape onto the body so I can glue on the template for the body outlinings. Okay, at first I have to change the collet to a 12 millimeter one, so I can install my spiral flush trim router bit. The spiral flush trim router bit is really sharp and leaves no markings on the body outlining, so you just have to sand it later with 180-240 grit sandpaper. I think the router bit is made by Klein, and I purchased it at Dieter Schmidt Feine Werkzeuge. Thank you, Dieter. An amazing selection of hand tools, which I appreciate very much. You can see I've done a good work with the bandsaw, and it takes no time to route out the body with the spiral flush trim bit. So I'm already finished. I am a very lucky guy owning a drum sander, and while my planar jointer leaves a very smooth surface on my body, I can use a 240 grit sandpaper on my drum sander, and this is such a smooth surface on this body. You can work with that. Absolutely awesome. This was a short take for my Instagram account. Follow me on Instagram, BruchholzBandit guitars. I would appreciate it. So this was a little bit of a mistake. This is a sanding machine, an oscillating drum sanding machine, and I know a lot of the guitar building guys use these cheap machines, but I think the drum is a little bit too slow, so it leaves shatter marks on the outlines of the body. And I told you before that with the spiral flush trim router bit, the surface, the outer surface of the body is good enough to sand it once again with 230 grit sandpaper, hand sandpaper. That would be a better choice. So here I made this big mistake, and after that I need a very long time with hand sandpaper to sand the shatter marks out. So don't use these cheap oscillating drum sanding machines. I have my Flot belt sander, which is a pretty good industrial machine, and also the belt speed is pretty high, so there are no marks on the wood, no burn marks, no shatter marks. Well, mistakes were made. It's just a normal learning lesson in building guitars. Okay, and then with the sanding block and some hand sandpaper, sanding down the shatter marks. I'm using this green guitar vise, which is a new one imported by Dictum. I searched a long time for the original vise made by Ulmia, but they are pretty rare, and when you find one, they are too expensive. So this one works fine and costs about 140 euros. So, talking about sandpaper, I can recommend Indasa sandpaper. I called them and asked them about sandpaper they recommend for harder woods like mahogany and oily woods like rosewood, and then they said, okay, sounds interesting, and we sent you a trial pack. Thank you, Indasa sandpaper. Awesome. The most difficult places to sand are the end grain places, so the beginning and the end of the body, and really long time to sand out shatter marks or marks from 80 grit sandpaper, 120 grit sandpaper. It's very difficult and takes a long time sanding, but sanding is pleasure. Because this is the great guitar build of Scratch build, I decided to increase the level of difficulty and put a purfling or a something like a center line decorative strip purfling inside the body. You can often see these backstrips on acoustic or classical guitars. Doing this on an electrical guitar is not that common, but I think it's pretty beautiful. So let's do this extra work and time with no function. The slot has to be 5.4 millimeters, so I decided to use my old Dremel with the precision router base and a spiral cutter bit from a CNC machine. Because the bit has just 3 millimeter diameter, I have to do 2 passes with my Dremel, and after that I would recommend doing this with a normal router, not with the Dremel and the precision router base, because a normal router has more weight and this makes it much easier. For this time, the precision router base with the CNC router bit is in danger to leave the slot slightly, but I managed to hide this with some mahogany dust and wood glue. Well, I'm happy with the final result. Looks good to me. One difficult step is to cut a slot on the side of the body. So you have to do this by hand, or you can do this by hand. I think sometimes a little bit of more handwork is relaxing to do. So I decided to cut this with a Japanese saw. I purchased it from Dictum, and a Japanese chisel from Feine Werkzeuge Dieter Schmidt. All tools have to be pretty sharp because this is, as you can see, end grain, and end grain is pretty hard to cut. So you need a sharp chisel and a sharp saw. Hey, I'm back. Next step I decided to do is to route out the electric cavity. I'm taking measurements and using templates from guitars and woods. This is a pretty big electric control cavity, but it helps also to reduce a little bit of the body weight. Because I don't want to overwhelm my drill bit, router bit, I make some pre-cuts with a Forstner bit. Here you can see my drill chuck decided to went off, so I don't think that was a good decision to do this with a hammer, but after this step it won't leave my drill press. So these are pretty sharp Forstner bits from Wirt. I think they buy it from Pharmac. This was a good investment because they are so sharp, and with hardwood or anything else they don't really have a problem to cut through. Sadly, the depth adjustment of my drill press isn't working anymore, so I have to be very careful not to go too deep, because as you go too deep it could be possible that you can see the center point of the Forstner bit after routing out the pickup, the electric cavity. So you need to leave at least 8 to 10 millimeters material. Now you can see me using double-sided gluing tape to glue on the template of the electric cavity. The template is 5 millimeter thick. That isn't much, but I have a really short flush trim bit with top bearing, so I don't have to dive in deep with my router bit, so I don't overwhelm it. I'm going to show you how I do a tummy cut. I don't do this often, so I've made a lot of learning experience from this. So drawing the tummy cut profile and then clamp the body down against the table so that nothing moves during the tummy cut carving session. I'm using a normal rasp. At first I've used my Iwasaka rasp, but with a normal rasp I am a little bit faster. Here too it is important to go with the grain, or to cut with the grain and not to cut against the grain, because cutting against the grain leaves some marks in the wood. Especially with the Iwasaka rasps, they are like a plane, like a lot of small planes on the surface, but so it's necessary to cut with the grain, because if you cut with the plane against the grain, it leaves teardrop marks. Best thing to do this work is with a scraper, with a sharp scraper. So I think this scraper is not so sharp anymore. I've decided to sharpen it during or after the video, I don't know. In the process of cutting the tummy cut, I decided to go with the rasp and against the rasp, Iwasaki file or sandpaper, as you can see here, then go with the scraper, and in the end I've used the scraper to leave the final surface, not with sandpaper, because with a scraper you can produce much sharper edges, which I think looks better. So I hope you like my video. Stay in contact with me, so subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow me on Instagram. I would appreciate it, and see you in episode 4. Thank you.